So most of the fires we had, since we didn't have practice jumps, most of them were fires. And the only other type we really ever got were rescue jumps. And the procedure on the standard fire jumps or the practice jumps, there were safety procedures, very set. And you stayed within those parameters. We figured the ground cutoff wind of about 30, 35 was max, as we determined from the drift streamers. And other features dictated whether we dry run or not, such as terrain, slope, time of day, of course the winds being the big one, especially with those old 28-footers. And dry runs were not all that uncommon. It was up to the choice of the spotter sometimes, and there was individualism shown there. But we did not risk a man's life for a goddamn fire. I had plenty of dry runs. I had no problem bringing those people back. Didn't care about that damn fire. The man's life is what counts. And we operated, as they do now, off a rotating jump list. When you come in from a fire, you went to the bottom of the list. As you work your way up, you get to be number one. You're going to be first man in the door on the next fire out. Well, on rescue jumps, I'm sure it's the same way now. They throw out all the rules. They handpick the crew, and they forget the jump list because you're going to jump. They were always, when a mountain pilot was past his ETA, his estimated time of arrival off his flight plan, we assumed he was down. And that's a rescue jump. And we're going to find that sucker. And we're going to do it right now. And we didn't have sophisticated methods of gear or anything else. We just piled in that goddamn airplane. The foreman or whoever the honcho was would handpick his crew to get the best jumpers he could, because it didn't matter what the terrain or what the conditions were, you're going to jump it. When you found it, you were going to jump it. We did hurt a lot of guys on rescue jumps. And we just crawled into that aircraft and hang rescue gear willy-nilly all over our bodies. That's the first time I've ever been in a Doug that flew full military power, red line. This was down a Lost Trail on the Idaho Divide. It was a TBM that was rigged for bug spray. And a pilot named Hardy Sandvig was flying the thing, young man. Some of the guys had been drunk in the cockpit bar with him. There was a bar at the airport called the Cockpit Lounge. Had been drinking with him the night before. And Hardy'd been flying bug spray down there on the Lost Trail Pass. And the TBM had a terrible characteristic that if it went into too tight a turn without enough power, it went into a full dive. And the only way out of a full dive is increase the power, full military power. And he went right straight in. So by the time we got down there, we could see the TBM. They were bright international orange. And you could see the pieces of it all over the goddamn place. But we saw a white parachute. Back then, some of the Johnson's pilots wore chutes. Some didn't, some did. I rigged a bunch of chutes for guys that wanted them. And we knew Hardy was packing a backpack. And we saw a white canopy down there. Maybe that sucker is alive. And Kraut was a spotter. And I says, we kept it off radio. We didn't want radio communication on this deal. We figured it was a fatality, despite that canopy down there. So to keep it off the radio, I says, we'll lay out, we didn't have radio. Well, we did have radios, but we used signal streamers all the time. And so we had signal streamers in our rope pockets. And I told Kraut, I says, if it's a fatality, I'll lay out an X. If the guy's alive, I'll lay out a circle. And the reason I picked that is I knew it was a lot quicker to lay out an X, because that's what we thought. He says, okay, keep it off the radio. So we jumped, and it was god-awful winds, and it was god-awful countryside. And we hurt a couple of guys. One of them pretty bad hurt hanging in a tree, but it didn't make it. And we hustled our ass down there, and they could tell by the twist on the props later that he'd gone in with full power, right? straight, right straight in. And that chute was deployed by impact. And that was the first time I'd ever been on a crash. And it had taken all the contents of Hardy's pockets and blown them out into the trees. He'd had a bunch of dollar bills and 5s and 10s and 1s and shit on him, and they were all festooned in the pea pines, just hanging. It just blew everything, exploded everything out of him. Of course, he was killed instantly. He had really, I'd never seen a body look like that. But what's really surprised me was there was no blood. I mean, he was just, and I couldn't figure out why there was no blood. I found out later that when the heart stopped, there's no blood. So he just looked like a cadaver. And his body was the furthest thing from the wreckage. It was all just in one spot. And his body went the furthest, just a few more, 20 feet out. And I'll never forget this. Is another one I can't. His head was rested right up against a big old pea pine. And you've heard in tornadoes, in a tornado, it'll take a straw and drive it into a plank. Well, right over Hardy's head, about right up here, was a color photograph of him and his wife and his 2 girls. Right over his... And that's the funny thing. See, those deals never really got to me until the last 10 years. Now they're starting to get to me. And they never did till the last 10 years. I wrote about that. You'll read it, Beth, in some of those stories I'm going to send you. And I ended that story up with a funny ending. It was very funny. Because I took a flight right after that, and I was scared shitless. And I did some weird shit, and the pilots laughed at me, and I almost tried to bail out without a parachute, because now I knew what the plane looked like when it went in, and I made it sound very, very funny. Because I kept it that way here until the last 10 years. So there weren't all that much drama. There wasn't all that hero bullshit. But the ones that I got on, and I was proud to be there, they really impacted me more than I ever realized. I just kind of stuffed them and let them slide. And I've talked with you about that, Bobby. You're a jump foreman. You stay cool, man. You don't show that kind of chicken shit. You don't show fear. You don't show panic. You don't dare. That's contagious. You tell those guys you're cool and do this and do that, and you got to have their trust and their faith. And besides, when that situation's over, you're going right back into another one, and you can't clutter your head up with all that shit. You got to be ready, of course, because you got a job to do. And we took that very serious, just like you men do now. It's a tough goddamn job. It can be a lot of fun. It can be parties in the woods and all that good shit. But it also was the roughest goddamn job I ever heard of. There was one guy, was a jumper here for years, and he went to Nam, and he did Nam, and he came back, and he went back into smoke jumping because he says it was the closest thing he knew to war. Now that came from a guy that had been there, so he could say that. He says it's the closest thing there was to war. It's just without the guns. And I don't know war. I never experienced it. I can't talk about nothing I ever didn't experience. But I guess I figured the impacts that are affecting me now fairly seriously, they weren't justified. I wasn't entitled because I wasn't a combat vet. And I spent quite a while telling myself, well, that's just bullshit, Davis. You're just feeling sorry for yourself. I don't know, somewhere in there is probably the truth. Somewhere is where it really is. And it's not drama, and it's not a big deal. It was just my big deal.